I'm going to start, if you don't mind. And oh, great. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ali Mirsapasi. I teach here in Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at NYU, and I would like to thank you all who are here in person and those who have joined us through Zoom on behalf of my colleagues in Iranian Studies program and also Kevorkian Center. Thank you so much for coming and being here. I hope you enjoy the discussion later. But before I go any further, let me make a couple of announcements and then introduce our speakers and go from there. We have our second program, which we are doing jointly with Ottoman and Turkish studies, is scheduled for April 17th. I have my colleague Aisha to make an announcement. Can you please share briefly what the program is about?
It is going to be on April 17th at 5:30, and it's going to be hybrid. We will meet here, but also you can.
Thank you, Aisha. And then our third or last program is scheduled for May 1st here, 5 in the evening. And that the May 1st event is another book discussion. It's a book by our colleague Norma Mazrui, who teaches at University of Illinois in Chicago. The title of the book is Tied Up in Tehran, Woman, Social Change, and the Politics of Daily Life in Post-Revolutionary Iran. Very descriptive and seems exciting title. I haven't read the book, but I have the book and will make sure that I read the book by May 1st. I hope you can join us for this particular book talk, but also that event is in person and virtually for those of you who would not be able to be here in person. Okay. The book that we are here for to celebrate and discuss is the a very recent book that was published in last year, right? In 2024 by Stanford University Press. The title of the book is The Incarcerated Modern, Prisons and Public Life in Iran by our colleague and friend, Professor Golnar Nikpour. Let me introduce Golnar and our discussion, Brian, and then go away so that we hear our speakers. Professor Golnar Nikpour is an assistant professor of history at Dartmouth College. Prior to joining Dartmouth College, Golnar was a fellow at the Center for Humanities, University of Wisconsin in Madison for 2 years, from 2015 to 2017. And then from 2017 to 2018, Golnar had a junior research fellowship at Crown Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Brandeis University in Boston. Good planning. This is, for those of you who are advanced PhD students, this is how you get a good job after you graduate. The fellowships are key. Um, Golnar has published many articles in journals such as the International Journal of Middle Eastern Studies and the Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. But she is also involved in more public scholarship and has published I certainly know of her writings in Jadaliyeh, but also in New York Times, among other venues. Thank you so much, Goldberg, for being here and for writing this fantastic book, and look forward to hearing from you. But before I really go away, I want to introduce our discussants. Brian Plunges is one of our own PhD students here in Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies, who has been working on what I would probably call oil modernity, although it's more interesting than just oil modernity. Maybe she can say a little more about her own work. So the way this discussion has been structured is that Golnar would speak for about half an hour about the book or whatever she would like to speak about, and then Brian will have some comments and questions that will go for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then Golnar would have 10 to 15 minutes to respond. Oh, and obviously, Brian is welcome to make some comments, and then we will have about 40 minutes, half an hour to 40 minutes for any comments and discussions that you have or questions that you have. Thank you so much again, all of you, and Golnar and Brian, and look forward to hearing from both of you.
Hello, is this working? Okay, great. Thank you all so much for being here this evening. I'd also like to sincerely thank Dr. Ali Mirzapasi for his generous invitation to be here, the Iranian Studies Initiative, the Kevorkian Center. I'd like to thank Brian Plunges for being my discussant, Sage Tabor for everything she's done to facilitate the event, and really everyone who is here today. It's really a pleasure to be here. My talk today is drawn from my recently published book, The Incarcerated Modern, Prisons and Public Life in Iran, which, as Ali mentioned, is out now on Stanford University Press and is about the history of prisons in modern Iran. So I will just get into some comments that I prepared for the day and then turn it over to Brian. Prisons in Iran have an unhappy global reputation. Even those with only cursory knowledge of Iranian politics have probably heard stories of arbitrary arrests, of torture, of executions in today's Islamic Republic of Iran. For their part, human rights organizations and Iranian dissidents and expatriates have worked to publicize the prison violence of the Iranian government, publishing memoirs, engaging in letter writing campaigns, founding organizations, etc. A network of Hi. Okay. A network of sometimes strange political bedfellows around the world has focused on Iran's prisons to name and shame the Iranian government, to push for the release of detainees, and in some cases, many cases, to advocate against the existence of the Islamic Republic altogether. And given this reputation, it might surprise some to learn that the Islamic Republic of Iran, that is the government in Iran after 1979, after the 1979 revolution, has also long used Iran's prisons as proof of its own legitimacy. Naturally, the story that the current government tells about the history of prisons in the country is one that's very, very different than the one told by its critics. For the Islamic Republic, the 1979 revolution represents an unequivocal break with the Pahlavi monarchy and with the violence and torture endemic to the former Shah's prisons. Reminding Iranians of pre-revolutionary prisons is something of a cottage industry for the post-1979 state, just as downplaying the Islamic Republic's own record of prison violence is those same officials' modus operandi. Members of the Islamic Republic elite who spent time in the prisons of the monarchy, up to and including leader Ali Khamenei, continue to trade in tales of their pre-revolutionary detention and torture, in just one conspicuous example of this discourse. And in what is perhaps the most physically conspicuous aspect of this discourse, the Islamic Republic has turned some of the prisons open during the pre-revolutionary era into museums, repurposing these spaces to affirm an official narrative that it goes along a telos of pre-revolutionary violence, revolutionary struggle, particularly and specifically for Islamists and clerics, and post-revolutionary freedom. So this is just one of those prisons, Qasr Prison Museum, which opened in Tehran, central Tehran, as a museum in the late 20-aughts, but was really Iran's major prison in the 20th century. But despite this present-day struggle over Iran's carceral record, Iran's prison system has its historical origins really in its modern prison system in the late 19th century. It is this longer history of the modern carceral state in Iran with which my book is concerned. And I'd like to stop for just a moment to explain what I mean by carceral. What I mean by carceral, the book is largely about prisons, but when I use the phrase carceral, I'm referring to linked systems of policing, surveillance, centralized law, punishment, incarceration. I chart Iran's transformation from a decentralized empire with a weak centralized state, without a centralized state, with few imprisoned persons in the late 19th century, into a modern nation state with a vast prison network today. The number of prisoners across Iran has steadily increased in the past century, culminating in an era in which, according to Iran's Organization of Prisons and National Security Measures, in numbers that are surely an undercount for reasons I can explain in the Q&A if people are interested, there are now at least 250,000 prisoners in about 270 official prisons. In charting these changes, my book asks, how and why did this massive transformation happen? How did Iranians come to understand their increasingly surveilled and punished social worlds? Importantly, how have Iranian governments, both pre and post-revolution, touted the benefits of their prisons? Of course, none of these governments say, like, hey, we're going to do torture and violence. They say that these institutions are going to help people. What political movements have emerged in the context of prisons? And how do we understand the sort of global role that transformations in policing and punishment have had in the changes that we see in Iran? Before going any further, just to introduce people to the temporal range in the book, I want to explain the sort of temporal range the book covers. So I start in the late Qajar era, really in about the mid-19th century, when Iran is a decentralized state. The central government doesn't have very much, if any, control over much of the provinces, and forms of forced confinement are relatively rare. It's in the Pahlavi era. Whoops. Okay. So yes, I covered the Qajar, the Pahlavi, and Islamic Republic eras. And this chronology covers, as those who know this history well will know, and those who don't will see, this chronology covers two major revolutionary movements: the Constitutional Revolution of 1905 to 1911, and of course the Islamic Revolution of 1979, as well as two coups in 1921 and 1953. And it shows definitively that the infrastructure of the carceral state, the modern carceral state, has undergirded ideologically opposed governments, even through moments of transformative political change. The book has 6 chapters, along with a introduction and conclusion. Don't worry, I won't read all these chapter names, but I put them up here just in case it would be useful to have a sense of it. There's one chapter on the Qajar era, 3 on the Pahlavi era, and the rest is on the Islamic Republic. The book begins in the 1848 to 1896 reign of Nasir ad-Din Shah, during which European colonial officers are a growing presence across Qajar Persia. And as I show in the book, are increasingly targeted, the archive shows that they're increasingly targeted for violence by locals. This in turn leads to or adds to growing anxieties about apparent Qajar lawlessness among colonial officers and among Iranian reformists and sort of proto-nationalists alike. This is one of the sort of inputs into leading for calls to increase policing, punishment. There's an obsession with legal reform in this era. And it sets the stage for Iran's first small modern prison network to be built in the 1910s in Tehran. The book moves to 3 chapters on the Pahlavi period, an era in which the modern legal and prison systems in Iran are really centralized and entrenched. It also touches on the political movements that arise in this era that, regardless of their political persuasion, whether the large leftist movements, the much smaller in the earlier period Islamist movements, nationalist movements, but across the board opposition movements that in many cases either write from prisons or write about prisons, and as a way of sort of formulating their ideas about liberation, about freedom. And then it moves on to the 1979 revolution, during which the carceral state again expands quite exponentially. And that's one of the things the book looks at very closely, despite a promise made by Ayatollah Khomeini before the revolution, that in a system of true Islamic justice, and this is a quote, no one would need to be imprisoned for even a single day. I end in the contemporary period, during which Iran's government has publicly avowed over and over again in the last 10, 15 years, a public goal of reducing Iran's prisoner totals. But I show in the book, in the last chapters of the book, that this promise and this effort, which has actually been, in my view, taken in earnest, has been nonetheless taken through a logic of carceral expansion, through the use of technologies such as ankle monitors, biometric surveillance, and other sort of state-of-the-art tech, what scholars in a different context call prison by another name. And now that I've shown you the structure of the book, I'd like to sort of run through some of its major arguments. My first argument is quite simple. The making of the modern prison system in Iran has led to an elemental transformation in Iranian life in the past century. The book examines key moments in the establishment of the prison system in Iran in the modern period, the resulting incarceration of millions over that time, and some of the responses to these new prisons. It's important to note that this transformation did not happen in isolation, but was rather part of a global trend in the era of promoting carceral solutions, that is, surveillance, policing, criminalization, to a host of social issues. It's genuinely difficult to overstate the changes that the modern carceral system has brought to Iran. And this is something people would know if they had read Dr. Ebrahimian's path-breaking work on this. For most of Iran's pre-20th century history, forced confinement was a relative rarity, and long periods of incarceration were rarer. There were other corporeal forms of punishment that were popular, such as the whipping of the soles of people's feet or the bastinado. And indeed, prisoners looked quite a bit different. We'll see a picture in a little bit of prisoners just a couple of decades after this image is taken at the turn of the 20th century. But in this earlier period, we're talking about relatively smaller numbers. They have stocks around their ankles, chains around their necks. Now, this is not to say that forced confinement didn't exist before the 20th century. Of course it did. But the jailing spaces were not systematized, nor were they capable of holding large numbers long term, nor was the sort of conversation around those spaces anything like the conversation we're going to get in the 20th century. The prison is a fundamentally modern institution, what historian Frank Decoter has in the Chinese context called a, quote, cathedral of modernity, one that has reshaped the fabric of Iranian life. The central argument of my book hinges on what I have termed the public life of the prison. I use this phrase in two linked senses, the first of which refers to the new public conversations that modern prisons elicited in Iran. The central topic of my book, prisons, have been subjects of great significance to Iranians themselves. As soon as plans for new prisons in Iran were formulated in the early 20th century, Iranians were talking about and writing about these spaces. After carceral centralization in the 1920s and 30s, Iranians had to learn together how not to get arrested and jailed, and what to do if they were. Like people everywhere. Because again, prisons are a modern phenomenon everywhere. That is not a uniquely Iranian story. Iranians did this through new genres, including prison memoirs, academic criminological texts, crime fiction, newspaper accounts, and of course, face-to-face interactions with these new institutions of modern policing and incarceration. The modern prison system has also proven foundational for Iranian political movements, and I think this will probably be a little bit more familiar for those who are familiar with Iranian political history. But Iranians have written on, organized activism around, and produced art and literature for decades, contemplating the relationship between power, citizenship, and incarceration. Important dissident parties were formed in prisons. It was in Ghast prison, the aforementioned space, that, for just one instance, a group of intellectuals lay the groundwork for the only mass-based party in the history of modern Iran, the Communist Tudeh Party. One of the party's founding members, novelist Bozorg Alavi, later claimed, "Prison for us was truly a school. We learned many things there, not only about social and political matters, but, well, what didn't we learn? For example, I learned Russian in prison. I learned English in prison. In prison, one read in earnest." In other words, prison was a space in which Alavi and his comrades fully committed to their political lives. And this wasn't unique to the Iranian left or to this moment or to this group. From the Iranian Communist Party in the earlier part of the 20th century to the Islamist Fadayin Islam Party to prison art of the 1970s guerrilla movements to prison writing and activism today. Virtually every Iranian political movement and party and group has produced work from or about carceral confinement. Incarcerated dissidents have endeavored to make the inner works of prisons public knowledge. So that's part of the story of the public life of the prison. And again, for just one example, that includes things like in the pre-revolutionary era, pamphlets that would have hand-drawn maps of Pahlavi era prisons, such as this one of the Comité Interrogation Center. And in those pamphlets, you see a lot of material like this because these interrogation centers in many cases would have been relatively new and there wasn't a lot of available information on them. And there's very similar efforts today. There are efforts to map Black sites that people are held and interrogated at and to share that information widely with both fellow travelers and with the public at large. That these movements have called for liberation from prisons, I argue, is reflective of the prison's public life. Yet, and this is genuinely the key for me here. The public life of the prison is not just that which dissidents have said or thought in response to incarceration. I argue instead that carceral practices have transformed all Iranian social worlds and public life, not just those of the most politically engaged. My argument is not merely that modern carcerality produced new public cultures in Iran, but rather that modern forms of incarceration have shaped the very notion of the public. This is the second sense in which I theorize the public life of the prison. In drawing and redrawing and in policing the line, the ever-shifting line between bad criminal and good citizen, the modern state has shaped and reshaped, or carceral techniques have helped shape and reshape Iranian notions of citizenship, freedom, nationalized inclusion, and exclusion. I'll give you an example. In labeling its prison factory social work, for instance, the mid-20th century Pahlavi government argued that expanding prisons were necessary to, quote, train and educate deviant Iranians so that they could live nobly, end quote, as productive citizens. State officials touted the rehabilitative capacity of these prisons. The names of Iran's prisons were at least officially changed in the 1960s in many cases to reflect this. The central prison for men and women, Zindan, was changed to penitentiary or place of repentance for men and women, Nedamatgah. While some prisons stopped using the word prison or Zindan altogether and instead called themselves Andarzgah, or place of counsel. This project has continued, albeit in different ideological dressing, in today's Islamic Republic. Referring to its prisons as virtue training schools, Omuzeshgah and Nikikha, the Islamic Republic similarly promotes prisons as a space where criminals turn into ethical, modern Islamic citizens. And if you go to the prisons organization website, that is the language they use exclusively, that these are places where, that they're virtue training schools. Welcome to our virtue training schools. Thank you for being here with us today. As the number of detainees in Iran's prisons has increased, members of both the Pahlavi and later Islamic Republic governments have promised that modern carceral methods would make Iranian citizens safer by imprisoning and reforming criminals into productive citizens. This process has been marked by a turn towards what I, borrowing from the tradition of critical prison studies, call the carceral imagination, or a way of seeing the world in which surveillance, policing, and eventually mass incarceration of large numbers of people is normalized and viewed as inherent to the project of progress, modernity, humanity, ethics, etc. And really, this is a point I can't emphasize enough, that both pre- and post-revolutionary governments discuss prisons as a way to make the country better, as necessary to make the country better, to make it more humane, more modern, more progressive, and today, more Muslim. Now, this brings me to another argument. Although my work focuses on prisons in Iran, it shows that the history of prisons is fundamentally global. Even places imagined to be politically opposed, like today's Iran and the United States, are often quite literally operating from the same carceral blueprints. In the book, I uncover previously undiscovered connections between places not typically imagined together, such as Mashhad and Marion, Illinois. Some prisons in the contemporary Islamic Republic were built in the 1960s from blueprints of what was then the brand new USP Marion in Illinois, now part of the federal supermax system. USP Marion was built virtually at the same time as its Iranian counterparts. So were similar prisons in Israel, New Zealand, and a couple of other places, as both penal systems experimented in confining troubled populations. In the United States, this was in the context of the Attica uprising. In Iran, there are new sort of political movements rising in the late 60s that the Iranian government is interested in controlling. But to situate this history in a global framework does not, for me, mean the erasure of its historical specificity. A brief example might better illustrate this. In today's Islamic Republic, for instance, the government has increasingly used new and globally popular technologies, such as the aforementioned ankle monitors and biometric surveillance, a fact that links today's Iran to cutting-edge surveillance tech the world over. Yet in Iran, this new tech is often used in novel ways, particular to the needs of a modern authoritarian Islamic government. In early 2020, so just as the sort of COVID crisis was hitting, the Tehran Guidance Patrol, often known as the Morality Police, the police force that would be responsible for the death of Gina Amini, the young Kurdish Iranian woman whose death launched an uprising in 2022, began using traffic cameras to issue text message summonses for women for alleged hijab violations. Those who didn't respond or who were issued repeat summonses were told that they would be in danger of having their cars impounded. This policy was a portent of the further expansion of this surveillance tech into the world of morality policing. Amid that 2022-23 uprising, law enforcement officials ominously promised an escalation in the use of these new technologies in policing hijab violations. So the government's investment in molding what it views as Islamic citizens, proper Islamic citizens, then is reliant on new carceral technologies that are used the world over by private and public, private companies and public governments alike to surveil, police, and punish behavior. Iran's modern prison system, as I argue, was a global project from the outset. The Pahlavi government under Reza Shah was quick to try to reform its carceral system along European lines, which were seen as the cutting edge at the time. In 1925, for instance, members of the Iranian police traveled to the International Penal and Penitentiary Commission Conference in London. It was the first time that an Iranian delegation participated in an IPC conference, but not the first IPC conference. They had been going on for some time. Sir Evelyn Ruggles-Breese, British president of the IPC, boasted that year, 1925, that the commission was, quote, a confederation of the most civilized states of the world, working quietly and unostentatiously to introduce greater humanity, that whole thing is a quote, to punishment systems around the world. Iranian delegates went home aiming to expand Iran's prison system along the lines promoted by the commission, but with what they felt would be a local flair. The most famous of these new prisons was Tehran's Qasr, which I've now mentioned a few times. By this point already, based on some earlier reforms that had happened in the 1910s and 1920s, there's already a change in the way prisoners look, the introduction in earlier decades of this form of standardized uniforms, and so forth. So already by the 1930s, we're looking at very different types of institutions than we were looking at just 20, 30 years before. Pahlavi Iran intended Qasr to be proof to the world that it was indeed a civilized modern state. But despite high hopes, prisons quickly became the object of criticism, eventually leading to a revolutionary movement that in fact took prisons as a central site of struggle. Iran's prisons would become so important to the anti-Shah movement that the 1979 revolution has been referred to by one intellectual as, quote, the revolution against torture. And yet, as we know, throughout the Pahlavi period, and now again in the Islamic Republic, Iranian prisons were touted as progressive reforms to the inhuman, uncivilized punishments that existed before their rule. So both the Pahlavi government and the Islamic Republic government come in and say, our prison system is going to undo the unjust things, the violent things that have happened in the past, and yet we see only the expansion of those practices in some cases into all sorts of new directions that hadn't been seen before. The role of the scholarly academy is key to this story, to the transnational carceral story. From its inception, Iranian criminology had a global horizon and has been part of the way that the modern carceral state has been sort of entrenched in the country. In 1950, 25 years after that prison conference, Iran sent delegates to a conference convened by the International Society of Criminology in Paris, which featured participants from 60 nations, Iran included. By mid-century, members of Iran's expanding law enforcement agencies, as well as academic criminologists, increasingly promoted Iranian prisons as therapeutic rather than punitive. They used this new language that prisoners were the patients and prisons would be the cure. In 1967, National Chief of Police Mohsen Mobassar expounded on this philosophy. He explained that Iran's prisoners were sick people who needed to be treated humanely so that they could be cured of their criminality, which was nothing more than a disease. And Mobassar wasn't the only member of the state elite to spread this message. No less a personage than Queen Farah remarked in 1968, most prisoners are capable of reform and cultivation. And are regretful of their criminal actions. Pahlavi prisons, the Queen explained, were spaces where the incarcerated were sent, quote, as punishment, not for punishment, end quote. And indeed, all of the sort of material produced by the government in this period is using this language and this discourse and drawing heavily from criminology to do so, working directly with academic criminologists in doing this work. Oops. Yeah. How do they do this? They talk about the need for more prison labor in order to transform prisoners into quote unquote good citizens. And all of this is happening in the context in which this is presented as a sort of enlightening process, right? So we see in this image the kind of telos that's presented. You go in as a prisoner, you're wearing your prison uniform, you're not in a good place, but when you come out, everything is doing better, you're following the light of enlightenment, you're clean cut, you look healthy, got a beautiful head of hair, and everything is looking up for you. Yeah, somehow you've grown taller. Yeah, pretty amazing, actually. Now, the relationship between Iran's prisons and the scholarly academy has perhaps, in my view, its most uncanny and, as an academic, sort of disturbing moment after the revolution. In 1995, the Prisons Organization, again, that's the sort of government agency that is formally in charge of most of Iran's prisons, although not all of its prisons. And again, I can talk about that in the Q&A if people are interested. In 1995, the Prisons Organization holds a 2-day academic conference inside of Evin prison. Oops. Yep. Evin, as many in the audience likely know, and I have some images, recent images from it here, is probably the most notorious of the prisons used in that post-revolutionary period. And a quick word on its history is here in order. Now, Evin was used in the pre-revolutionary period. It was built under the Shah in the early 1970s, but expands in use immediately after the revolution. On February 11th, 1979, as the revolution is sort of final success of the revolution is happening, jubilant revolutionaries storm Evin to free it of what they believed were thousands of hidden prisoners that had not yet been released. They arrive and find pretty much no one left in there. They've all been released at this point. And as I describe in the book, they have this really unbelievable, almost slapstick experience of accidentally locking themselves into Evin and needing to call for help. But so the revolution sort of happens with the doors of prisons being thrown open. But by February 15th, just 4 days later, the facility is searched by munitions and bomb and mine engineers to make sure that it's safe. And it is, again, sort of started to be used as a political prison. Exponentially more Iranians would be detained in Evin by the Islamic Republic than had ever been held there under the Shah. Its initial capacity, Evin, when it was opened in the early 1970s, were 320 persons. The number of detainees in the space in 1977 was approximately 1,500. But by March 1979, barely 5-6 weeks after, at the end of March 1979, just a few weeks after the success of the revolution, over 7,200 detainees were held there. This expansion would only continue. Today, the prison remains operational. Its official capacity is 15,000, but these images leaked in 2021 reveal that the number of persons held there is likely much, much larger. The spaces that we see are wildly overcrowded, and the official tally seems to not be able to account for this. In the public life of Iran's post-1979 prisons, then, Evin would quickly become a name synonymous with the system of injustice that prevails in Iran. And that's a quote from a human rights organization. A one-word reminder of the expansive carceral violence of the post-1979 state. So it should be clear just why it's astonishing to imagine an academic conference happening there, 2 days long, where academics, sociologists, medical scholars, medical researchers, humanists, they go to Evin and they stay there, like that's their hotel, and have a 2-day long symposium. The keynote address was delivered by none other than Asadullah Lajaverdi. Now, Lajaverdi was no stranger to Evin. He was imprisoned there under the Shah, and returned, which you see his mugshot to the left, and returned there to serve as its warden from 1980 to 84, earning the moniker the Butcher of Evin. The image on the right, he's kind of in the middle, and that's an image from Evin. And he would be affiliated with, sort of associated with and affiliated officially with the prison and with the prisons organization, on and off until his assassination in 1998. Story of Lajaverdi's cruelty to imprisoned dissidents, whom he referred to as his guests and whom he also claimed to be educating, are legion. In his years as Evin's warden, prisoner education was a matter of breaking down dissidents until they gave forced confessions, recanting their political views and swearing newfound allegiance to the Islamic Republic. Years later, this brutal legacy of prisoner education haunts the technocratic language that the prisons organization attempts to adopt. And indeed, the prisons organization, if you look at their material, are constantly promoting essentially this idea that they are partially a pedagogical or scholarly organization. They publish an enormous amount of scholarship. They partner Iranian scholars with scholars in all over the world, not so much with American scholars for obvious reasons, but Asian scholars, European scholars, Latin American scholars to do this prison research that they're constantly saying is making Iran's prisons safer, better, so on and so forth. So there's a lot more to the book, but I will briefly sort of gesture towards one final argument that I make in the book, and I can discuss any of these things further if people wish, and then I'll wrap it up. There's really one final argument in the book that I'd like to briefly highlight here as a kind of provocation, something to think about together. Despite the very obvious significance of political prisoners in Iranian carceral modernity, the Incarcerated Modern, although it looks very closely at those prisoners, it looks at things like the 1988 prison massacre and so on and so forth. The Incarcerated Modern does not limit its analysis to prisoners of conscience or prisoners of politics. Instead, I look at Iran's prisons more broadly and include a closer look at those who in Persian are often referred to as Iran's ordinary or common law prisoners, and into the logics that has captured so many of those people in behind bars. Common law prisoners, of course, have always represented the overwhelming majority of Iran's incarcerated population. But it's not simply because of their large numbers that large numbers of prisoners have been held on sort of ostensibly non-political charges. Think drug offenses or sex work, vagrancy, theft. I mean, anything up and down, border crossing. That I turn part of my attention to those detainees. Indeed, I make the argument that we should work to denaturalize the entrenched logic through which we conceptually and thus politically separate these two populations. There is an enduring view, and this is not an Iranian phenomenon, it's sort of a fact of the matter. There is an enduring view that divides prisoners into hermetically sealed categories of political and non-political, a logic that tacitly, if not explicitly, imagines all common law prisoners as real criminals who by definition deserve anything that they receive, just as it imagines political imprisonment as something that only happens over there in illiberal places such as Iran. Despite this logic, many of the ostensibly non-political charges for which people are detained in Iran, as elsewhere in the world, stem from obviously political issues. The historical processes through which all modern states have naturalized the notion that all sorts of social issues, from drug use to sex work to refugee border crossing to certain but not all forms of violence, demand state carceral intervention and prisons specifically, as opposed to, for instance, investment in mental and public health. Is it still working? Kind of cut out. Education. Thank you. It's okay? It kind of, you heard that, right? Okay. I'm not. Okay. Yeah, no, it's fine. Luckily I'm almost done. So, where was I? Oh, demand that these social issues demand carceral intervention have themselves been a product of profoundly political processes and historical processes, and relatively recent ones at that. A historical example, very brief, might help illustrate the stakes of what I'm getting at. In the 1980s, the nascent Islamic Republic and Ronald Reagan's United States both inaugurated policies, very different policies, that nonetheless had similar outcomes, which was driving vast increases in their respective rates of incarceration. Now, in both countries, these detainees were largely held on drug charges. As each country undertook its own war on drugs under radically different circumstances, the US as part of a racist, tough on crime policies, and the Islamic Republic as part of Khomeini's promise to purify Iran of counter-revolutionary or un-Islamic decadence, increasing numbers of socially vulnerable people were ensnared in each state's dragnet. And of course, in Iran, they're also in many cases executed. So again, my argument is not that they're identical, but that we need to sort of think about what does link these logics. Yet despite the very self-evidently political nature of decisions like these, we have not historically thought of drug-related detainees in either space as political prisoners. Nor do we typically ask why similar expansions of the carceral state targeting drug users were enacted in numerous places simultaneously, not only Iran and the US, but several other places, probably most noteworthily Brazil. To the contrary, our conventional categories push us to see incarceration in places like Iran and the US, other spaces, as sort of fundamentally different, despite evidence to the contrary. It also makes us sort of advocate in a way that highlights some but not all prisoners, and these are often decisions that have unintended class bases, right? Because the average political dissident is often more well-educated, comes from different class backgrounds, etc. The stakes of this argument are rendered all the clearer when considering that today's Islamic Republic has justified its actions against not only ordinary criminals, but also political dissidents by saying what all governments do. We don't have political prisoners. They are mere criminals. They are terrorists. They are people who are threats to national security. As Iranians all too well know, the intrusive forms of surveillance, policing, and punishment at the heart of the carceral state have instead too often been linked to the project of social repression and autocratic forms of political power. But despite their omnipresence today, prisons, in my view, and what I believe my book shows, were not a historical inevitability anywhere in the world. This book is thus undergirded by, it has a lot of historical arguments, and this is to some extent a sort of future-oriented argument. which is that to understand the historical origins of the modern prison in Iran is to also be able to imagine a world beyond the prison. If you see how something started, you might see how something might change in the future. It is towards that horizon of freedom and the people in Iran struggling towards that horizon that this book is oriented. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Is this okay? Yeah. Okay, great.
All right. Thank you for that. That was a really wonderful presentation. It's really such a rich
I'm
book.
gonna take Lajaverdi off of our.
Yeah, I was gonna
just do something a little more. The cover of my book is probably. Yeah, there. Now I'm advertising.
It is really such a rich book. It's really historically dense. I think it's like the whole book is 350 pages, but the writing is 220. There's a lot of like, it's there's so much detail that goes into it. But I think it's really impressive. One, I saw the kind of earlier version of this that was published in the Global 79 edited volume, and I think it's really a testament to where like the idea of the global is going, and it's not just here are all these connections I found, pointing to them and saying this has a significance because it's global. The way that you kind of weave the global into this history, it's given me a lot to think with. I'm trying to. I had a bunch of notes. I wrote a bunch of notes over those notes. We'll see what happens. But there's a lot to think with, and I'm trying to not just think through this institution, but kind of the consequences of some of these arguments when you start reading them back into really fundamental issues in Iranian history and political thought. And it's also inspiring for me just as I'm working on my project on oil, but trying to trace something across different eras and seeing it interact with all these, like you said, kind of strange bedfellows and how people understand it organically and how they revisit it at different times. So I think this kind of project that can break across conventional histories where people see ruptures, you kind of see very clear continuities is very helpful. So like you said, this is a history of the Iranian prisons, but it's really a history of carceralization in Iran, the institutionalization, the institution building, the professionalization that becomes mapped on and kind of grows up with nation building and then sustains itself across revolutions. And it sustains itself across revolutions, not just in terms of political upheavals, but all these kinds of changing ideas. You have modern, like scientific proposals, proposed reforms about those proposals, abuses by the state, responses to that, shifting promises, these, like we said, presumed historical ruptures. And then despite all this, you get the maybe unexpectedly the continued expansion of a system that is attacked from all different sides, but seems to have a longevity that is unexpected when you look at it and you think of how many people are invested in opposing it or do not want to end up in a prison. And then across all this, the dynamics and logics, this carceral imagination you were talking about, that undergirds and propels these developments, most of the times intentionally, but a lot of times inadvertently. You see people try to attack the carceral logic or the prison system from different angles, and they end up kind of propelling it in a new direction, not really blunting its progress. So the first thing I wanted to say is that I really admire that. I thought this was a very like patient book. The introduction it talks about the significance of the Iranian prison, but the theoretical aspects of it don't come in maybe to like the third chapter as much. The first two are very patient. I mean, like historically, it's very rigorous, but this is not a book that is just kind of overwhelmed with dates and figures and quotes for the sake of quotes. Doesn't go off on historical tangents, but it's showing you this kind of slow building, this ball that's getting rolling in different ways. People are understanding it. But I think one important thing in the introduction, it doesn't lead with like a capital T theory. Here's everything you could know about Foucault that could possibly apply. Here's everything about prison abolition and all these kind of critical prison studies, which could have bogged down the book or could have, I think, really colored how the history would be perceived. And so I'd say it's patient in that it lets the kind of history and kind of a state perspective with some perspectives from below build for the first two chapters from the Qajar period across the constitutional revolution into the Pahlavi period. But then you get this kind of payoff, I think, in the third chapter where you start talking about guerrilla movements. And then from there, human rights. You're kind of seeing this scaffolding and this kind of uncomfortable mapping over the theories that were originally there. Okay, we need something different. People call for a reform. And there's kind of this mapping. And then you get this, not overdetermined, but this very messy patchwork, this kind of like barrel of things people can pull from. And then you see the Pahlavi state getting very creative. with how they're trying to legitimize these prisons, or how they're trying to explain why they're being expanded. And then that is not, there's no rupture in terms of a state that wants to legitimize its use of prisons. There is a kind of explosion when you, across the revolution in prisons, and carcerality and this imagination become very central to this project that is, in some senses, completely, revamped. And there is a revolution in terms of ideas, but it builds off of these kind of reformist, humanist ideas that come before. So yeah, starting with I think when you get to the guerrilla movements, you're starting to see the contestation over meanings at the same time that there's institution building. There are actual questions of materiality, of space. Where do we put these people? How many people to a cell? Things like that. And then people are experiencing these prisons. You say it's for the guerrillas, they're kind of the most immediate space of contact with the state. So it's the space from which they theorize state power. So these people going in, experiencing the prisons, their ideas are coming out. If not, they're coming out, and you have this kind of I don't know if dialectic, because we know that the police lieutenant likes to, that too was co-opted, the idea of dialectics in prisons. But you kind of have this continual exchange that is building the prisons at the same time that it's an institution that is just growing and expanding in relation to state power. So yeah, you have the guerrilla movements, you have people talking about the imperialist capitalist state, and then this gets mapped onto human rights. There's some left organizations trying to use human rights. There's kind of tension in the beginning of human rights between it as a collective idea versus an individual idea. I've seen this in some scholarship before, sometimes with like refugees, but this is a prison population as an inherently collective thing in this kind of uncomfortable situation relationship with this, what ultimately wins out, this liberal humanist individualist idea of human rights. But it's very interesting to see these potential alternatives of how people are using their prison experiences, talking back to global discourses, and then you kind of end up with this hodgepodge that can be ultimately still co-opted by different forms of state power. I think in terms of directions you can go, there's the anecdotes or kind of the different stories you illustrate. One I really liked was when you're talking about author Reza Barani, and he kind of gets pigeonholed into this, like he's the Iranian author of the Gulag Archipelago, and it's this Cold War conservative anti-torture kind of screed, and he kind of is uncomfortable in this space. So it's very interesting to see these unusual bedfellows kind of develop in real time. And I think a lot of this just shows, as you're tracing this very carefully, you can't, I think it's there is a kind of prerogative in Iranian studies, or these kind of, when you're studying revolutions, to talk about ruptures and continuities, but you can't just theorize away the idea that there was some rupture. So in this patience and this kind of mapping on, you're showing these continuities and these kind of these seeds, these roots that are really connected, kind of in subterranean ways as much as they are above the surface. And then this battle over language and institutional control continues after the Iranian Revolution, into the Islamic Republic, and you see the power of it, that it can be kind of manipulated in all different ways. So I think early on in the book, you say that you want to denaturalize the Iranian prison. I think the book is incredibly effective at that. Prisons as institutions and the carceral imaginaries that come with it. But I think once you get to the end of the book, it's not a disorganized book by any means, but once you finish it, it's a little bit dizzying when you think of, for me at least, like how much you would need to rethink in terms of not just Iranian history, but ideas of citizenship, just kind of genealogies of like Iranian political thought and the limits of state power, things like this that are very central to so many aspects of Iranian political thought, political history, and kind of global history. So one example, and it happened in real time while reading this, you have a quote after talking about the green movement, and then the 2022 Women Life Freedom Movement. You have a quote from historian Peyman Jafari, where he says, basically these events remind us that, it's a potent reminder that radical change in Iran will come from inside and below. So you're talking about people in Iran are kind of rejecting reform increasingly. But this idea that radical change will come from inside and below, I had to kind of stop and pause, because these categories are ones that you've unpacked throughout the book, and they are very different than from inside and below, this kind of almost like hopeful social space that this is going to come from. And it made me think back to in the first chapter, we were talking about the Qajar period. So there's all these British people that are being attacked, and there's lawlessness, and they're very uncomfortable, and they decide to draw up a blueprint to turn their consulate into kind of like a a semi-prison, semi-barrack. And so you say the spatial reordering is nonetheless illustrative of a modern carceral strategy, delimiting space to produce a social division between the inside and the outside of both the space and law. So this project of who controls what spaces, who is allowed where, for what reasons, this idea of mobility, you bring this up. Again, there's not a huge literature review right at the beginning that tells you every theory that you need to know, but they emerge very organically. Your kind of references to theories. So later in the book, you're pulling from Umi Tufigan when he says incarceration is always a bordering practice. So this kind of delimiting of space. And so it made me think, starting in 1908, starting before that, you have a state that is not just trying to pull people out of society, it's kind of fracturing what we mean by inside. What is inside Iranian society? What is below? If the state understands that there is a threat from a certain below, you can fracture it. You can stop making people move in certain ways. And the prison is very central to this, and the carceral imagination is very central to this. So again, ending the book, it was kind of dizzying. Think through, okay, the repercussions that this could have for political thought in a lot of different venues, but also the directions of power. You have prisoners and the state, people learning from prisoners, people learning from the state, learning from the prisoners, all these different categories. And it's not just a kind of unidirectional or bi-directional means of power. The prison is kind of this, it's got this charge, and it kind of it unleashes a lot of different energies out into society. I can skip through a little bit of this. I think I was really happy you touched on this kind of key intervention of reclaiming what is the political, when you're talking about political prisoners, talking about common law prisoners, and this underlying logic. And I think this attacks is kind of some of these liberal myths at the center of this. But I think it really kind of reinvigorates and gives new potentialities to all these historical and theoretical connections you can make to once you start including all these other populations who are caught up in this, not accidentally caught up in this dragnet, but are intentionally part of this larger political process. Second, and I'm glad you mentioned it too, the idea of the global and why it's important. Like I said, this is not just kind of the novelty of connections, but showing you how these ideas are being translated, changing, moving, and how they kind of seep into unexpected spaces. So when you have, as I said, the Major General Mohsen Mobassar using dialectics to explain why prisons are scientific, humane, effective, and these reasons, you have communist global thought coming into Iran, changing to local particularities. You have the same thing happening with prison sciences, and you get this kind of, not just, it's beyond any kind of clear delineation of local and global, and I think it's a very interesting way to tell histories, and one that people can really kind of learn from. And the third, talking about carceralization, this imaginary, as producing the very notion of the public, and it happens on all different kinds of levels. The first and the most obvious, maybe just looking at what prisoners do together. They're developing languages, political thought. They're committing to their political lives, as you said, but it's torture as something wielded by the state against these dissidents, and then these dissidents then wielding the idea, the images, the stories of torture against the state, and this kind of merry-go-round of trying to attack each other, and where these techniques of the state kind of come into these narratives and how they go out into the public. So prison as an education, both as the state trying to re-educate people and people in prison learning about the state from this and trying to educate people on the outside of how to attack, reform, whatever their political project may be. So in prison, people are learning. Outside, this language is seeping. I think it was an important kind of point underneath that the global influences do not necessarily automatically mean global awareness of this. So you have all these global influences, and it's not until you have these dissident, diasporic student movements until the 60s that Iranian prisons and tortures under the Pahlavis get kind of swept up in this global anti-torture, anti-prisons rhetoric. So this different levels of the global and awareness of the global, both within and outside Iran, I thought was interesting, and the turning prisons into museums and this kind of selective historical memory is a very powerful weapon. And the third level, I think just when you look through, you can look through the history and, okay, it's interesting that prisons have been here during every kind of different political era in modern Iran, but how many different intellectual streams of thought that they go through. I think it's very serious. People should take this seriously in terms of rethinking aspects of Iranian intellectual history, and then you could abstract that out to just theories of the modern liberal state in general. What are these? What are the limits of power? What is implicit when we talk about state power? So this goes through, you have the law and order of the, law and order calls for law and order during the constitutional revolution. So first chapter is called lawlessness and order. So this kind of, out of this lawlessness comes these calls for this. And they want to curb state power, but I think there's no thought of how big the state can get and how it would wield these kind of powers. It gets caught up in these civilizational discourses, and then this transitions in the Pahlavi period to the idea of what is a modern progressive nation state? How do we show our citizens and people outside? And then I think it's very convincing that prisons are always, if not explicit, an implicit part of what state power will entail. If Reza Shah is a modernizer who rules with a heavy fist, people talk about the modernization part, and they don't really ask how the fist works. How do you build these kind of things? So I think it's really important to kind of look into how rule of law becomes law and order, becomes we need societal order, and the laws kind of need to bend to that. And you have this is kind of being bent or refracted, if not exactly through the prison, then through this carceral logic. Yeah, scientific positivism. You have this medical language of curing people, which is interesting because it's novel, but it's there in this carceral logic. It's the solution to the problem that is society. Psychology, therapy. If you can change people in prisons, you could probably break them too. So this body is so it's. I think the point being that prisons are not kind of a passive rider on these transformations in political thought. They're right there. They're very active in terms of this, and they're a space of experimentation for both the state and dissidents, or even just the experiences of quote unquote non-political, not even prisoners, but just citizens in general. And then on to ideas of revolutionary liberation, human rights, Islamic ethics. And it's interesting that despite the attacks on the prison, despite the critiques of the Pahlavi use of the prisons, that the institution is not attacked as directly as one might think, and instead the post-revolutionary state is given, at least in the beginning by most people, like this kind of moral mandate to carry on. And they're not, even though you saw the Pahlavis kind of weaponize these infrastructures, these technologies that were being built during the Qajar period, people are not seeing that increased state power, these institutions can be wielded again, and they can be reinvented and expanded further. So into my questions, I have two, and I wanted to relate them to two audiences I thought could be coming to this book, especially audiences from outside Iranian studies. So the first I saw because I think that it's as I said, it's a patient book, but it's dealing with very complicated material that is so charged. It's kind of like very sensorially charged. The initial descriptions of torture and bastinado takes a little bit to kind of ease into it and be like, okay, I guess we just need to paper over this for a time, because the kind of embodied experience of it can be intense, but I think you do a great job handling that material. But you say that you're kind of navigating this moral geography as well as this kind of historical geography. And so I think one group that could be coming to this is kind of liberal human rights advocates, people that know about the post-revolutionary state and who rightly think, these human rights abominations in Iran, Islamic Republic prisons need to be stopped. If you can't change the entire system, you should at least be able to curb the worst kind of abuses of this. And so we don't have to get into the people that manipulate this for their own political ends. But throughout the text, there's this idea of the kind of reformist lexicon that it's just prisons are not being used right. We need punishment in society. We need to stop bad things from happening. And we just need to kind of do this better. And you could arrive at this from two ways, kind of this abstract universal perspective, or you could do, torturing individual suffering, again, this kind of embodied experience of supposedly innocent people is just being misapplied by the state. And you kind of end up at this liberal humanism that wants to make things better. But I think throughout the book, you show that the liberal humanism wasn't actually driving cause of this kind of these scientific technologies. They're in very human language of trying to cure people, trying to fix these things. It almost feels like a kind of dead end. So one question would just be, what can we learn about, what can we learn from this book about why and how this kind of liberal reformist language can be so easily co-opted by states, and how do we kind of move away from this? And I was interested when you were talking about Iranians are kind of rejecting reform of the Iranian political system today. Are these critiques coming from, I'm going to assume not to the same extent, but from extensive histories that you're kind of dealing with? You're showing this long history and why we need to reject reformist language. People are arriving at it from other directions too. But I think the directionality of the critique is important, and kind of having that historical undergirding. So I don't want to overload too much, but the second audience I thought would be kind of people coming from an abolitionist or kind of radical political horizons. And you do say in the book that your project is ultimately a critical one, insofar as it's the undergirding proposals is that there is simply no reform that can salvage modern prisons from its foundational modern role as a space of extraordinary violence, discipline, and repression. But you don't automatically arise at, thus the answer is abolition. And you do a very good job in short space showing, okay, U.S. kind of Western ideas of prison abolition come from a very specific history: transatlantic slave, a certain kind of racialization. And you also say, for those of us dreaming about a world with beyond a prison, should we all be dreaming in the same language? And a question would just be thinking about translation, legibility. What from your book could we take to kind of think through what that language should be, and how we should think about how thinking about this language differently in different cases? So I'll end there. But
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. Those are really big, hard questions, so I have to take a second. I scribbled a bunch of notes for myself. And I'll try to be brief because I've already talked a bunch, and I'll try to open it up to hear more from people. I'll come to the last thing that you said in a moment. I just want to gesture to a couple of the earlier things you said. First of all, thank you so much. That was a very generous set of comments. You know, we toil on these projects on our own. It's a bit of a lonely process, so it's always a pleasure to know that someone's taken the time to read and sort of think critically about the work that we do. So thank you for that. Yeah, I want to start by saying something more about the divide, you know, the sort of the binary that I'm trying to trouble, but also troubled by my own troubling of the political, non-political prisoner categories. In the first place, there's a part of the back of my mind that always says, and I try to say this clearly in the book, that actually this divide is an institutional one, and it is a formal one, insofar as in the Iranian context, historically, both in the earlier time periods and today, those who are considered common law prisoners are typically held separately and sort of treated separately, in some cases sort of dealing with separate courts, separate legal structures, several sort of institutions of law and order, as are those who are considered security prisoners, whom we typically refer to as political prisoners. So there is this historical divide. It wouldn't be right to sort of collapse all of this into one sort of mush, right? And I try to be attentive to that. Just like any binary, there's something it can teach us and something it can show us about how institutions produce new subjectivities and so forth. At the same time that I think it's worth kind of asking about the underlying assumptions to those divides. So for me, wanting to sort of trouble that, even as I hold that question open to critique, is because I think that there are horizons of, you know, this is one of the things, you know, a lot of the book is historical. It's looking at the past. But this is one of the things that's looking towards the present and the future in a way that's meant to be oriented towards a form of politics, right? This goes to your question about the radical imagination versus the liberal imagination and so forth, which is to say that, in my view, at least troubling this binary to some extent, and troubling it in an aspirational way, where we're actually asking ourselves and each other to make interventions on behalf of people who don't feel as much like us as some other people might, is to actually understand that these things are much more linked than we've realized. I'll give an example. For those who follow Iranian politics closely, but who maybe not every single day, but pretty closely, many people probably first heard of Kahrizak prison around the time of the 2009 Green Movement and the months of protests and mass arrests that happened in that time. This protesters died in this context, in this prison. It became actually quite a scandal in the Iranian context. And it became that at that point, the word Kahrizak became a kind of commonly known space among Iranians, both in the country and in diaspora. And it hadn't really been until that point, unless you were a very close follower of politics. But there had already been some prisoner movements on behalf of those who had been held at Kahrizak a few years prior. Kahrizak was first used in the early 2000s as part of these sweeps done by the then the sort of law and order mayor of Tehran at the time of poor people's neighborhoods and of places that were claimed as spaces of drug use, violence, so on and so forth, but were among some of the poorest member strata of Tehran's underclass. And their their families and some small movements on behalf of those relatively powerless people was sounding the alarm about Kahrizak 5-6 years before 2009. It did not make very many waves among the Iranian diaspora, among Iranian activists in the country, among human rights activists. Of course, some people were doing that work, I highlight. I try to make that clear in the book, right? But it wasn't until this other, much more visible population were held, and the same things were done to them. They were held in incredibly, it's a facility that's partly on sort of below ground level. They were held in incredibly overcrowded conditions. People died, etc. So my argument here is that often techniques or tactics or spaces that are used on one vulnerable population, if they prove effective, will be used on another vulnerable population. That's something we see all over the world, right? So again, in some ways with this argument, the historical and the sort of imaginative are in a little bit of dissonance, because historically there is a divide between these categories, and it's important to understand how they've been treated and why certain legal things happen for some group and not the other. At the same time as we understand that ultimately, our futures are linked, right? If we wish to see a better world, our futures are linked. So it's a kind of aspirational effort to think through what are ultimately political decisions, what are ultimately about which populations come to be seen as expendable, as able to be sort of cut out of the sort of community of humanity as it's imagined in this case in the Islamic Republic. So that's the sort of way I think about, it's really that Kahrizak example from which I came to see this argument the most clearly. The other thing I sort of want to briefly say is on the question of translation that you raised. Thank you. I tried. You mentioned that the book is patient. I appreciate that, and particularly that you noticed that it doesn't really begin with an overloading of theory. That is partly the function, and this is my one word of advice for graduate students, of a lot of rewrites of the introduction. So if you read earlier versions of the book, it actually does read very dissertation-y. Here are the theories I dealt with, here are the archives I'm looking at, and here's my very clunky effort to put them together. It's through writing and rewriting that I came to a point where I was trying to tell the story more as an actual narrative of how I came to the ideas and deal with the things that actually still had some dissonance in my mind. Yeah, of course, if you're writing about modern prisons, every time I give a talk, I mean, almost every time I give a talk, like 90% of the time, someone asks me a question about Foucault. It has to be in the book, like I have to put in the book what I think about those things. But I wanted it to actually come from a place of kind of engaging with all of that material over time and organically as possible. And one of the things that I came to is to actually try to dwell not only in, there's a kind of idea about translating theory into any given context, right? But for me, what came to be really interesting and illuminating is thinking about the words, the language, the ideas that are coming out of Iranian prison discourses of various stripes that I had to actually translate or retranslate or think about in more capacious ways. One of the words, and I do a long thing in the book about a term that is in almost all of these discourses from different angles, which is tarbiyat. Those who speak Persian or Arabic know that that word has a lot of different valences. Depending on the context, it might be translated as education, as discipline, as punishment, as hitting your kid upside the head, as, the word can mean many, many different things. But what's interesting is that it turns up in this prison discourse in so many different ways. So when Farah says, Oh, where does she say it? Yeah, that prisoners are capable of reform and cultivation. I translate tarbiyat as cultivation here because of what she goes on to say, that they can learn, that they can kind of ascend to new heights of understanding, that they can be transformed, that they can cultivate themselves into better people. There is this there are these prison writings and prison statements made by guerrillas. In the case I'm thinking of by particularly by leftist guerrillas, who in some cases say, yeah, the state can tarbiyat me. They will tarbiyat me into a stronger, more revolutionary subject, right? So I will discipline myself. They think they're disciplining me in one way, but I will cultivate and discipline myself in another way. I will educate myself in another way. If you go to the prisons organization website, it talks a lot about tarbiyat, about education, about. So for me, part of the translational question is also thinking about how language works in this context, the different valences that these terms bring, and trying to bring that to understand that no amount of theory actually gets at the heart of how people talk about and talk to each other, to really think about the way these terms have changed or how they're being used, and to try to think, I mean, even the way in which the term for prison has changed several times, to try to think critically about those things and to put them into conversation with the theoretical models that I've also sort of engaged with. And then the last thing I want to say, you raised so many things, but I don't want to go on any too much longer. The last thing I want to say is, the question you raised about the sort of tension between the individualist model in liberal politics, the idea of the individual subject of rights, versus a kind of more collectivist vision, however that might be defined. And you actually, I heard in your question, I don't know if you intended it this way, but what I hear in that question, and kind of pushing me to think about what it is at the end of the book, that it's dizzying, and what it is that I'm really trying to get at, is that I think it's clear that the book is much more comfortable as a historical work than it is as a prescriptive work. It's not like there's not like a secret page on the end that tells you like, and thus this is what we need to do, right? Like that doesn't work that way for this book at any rate. And one of the things in doing this research that I came to realize, at an earlier point, I was much more critical of some of these discourses one way or the other. And I came to realize, well, you look at you can look at the efforts made by human rights organizations and those human rights activists and sort of global liberal activists, and say that on some level they failed, right? These violations continue. They are expanding in use. Iranians are confronting them every single day. But that also the collectivist vision presented in the late 1970s, and this is something that there's very few voices right at 1979 who are espousing that human rights language. There is a profound desire to punish the fallen government, not only by the victorious Khomeinist faction, but by leftists and other Islamists alike. So that collectivist vision also in this important moment is it fails in the sense that it is not able to sort of curtail its own sort of retributive violence. So how do we deal with that? You look at all these different options and none of them is a skeleton key that opens like a liberated future. Well, we think there's a few ways for me to think about that. One is that you just we all continue to do our best. You put your one foot in front of the other and you try to actually put these things continuously in conversation and really interrogate your own assumptions to say like, we have to think critically about these failures as meaningful, right? As embedded in the structures, and think about how we might move forward. You make the road by walking, in other words, not by coming up with a theory and then trying to practice it. The other answer is like, I'm a historian. If I knew much more about what to do in the future, I would. I think that for me, I just try to think. What I've learned over the years is to try to actually take these theoretical models, the efforts of people to make the world a better place, really, really seriously, and in a way be more generous with even things that don't make as much sense to me or aren't my worldview, to try to say, if to try to actually take them seriously as ways to see the world and visions of and how historical change is made. And the book really is just an effort at that. I don't know that even if I wrote it 6 months after I published it, I might have written it a little bit differently, right? So I'm always thinking about those questions, and I appreciate you raising that.
Thank you very much, Golnar, for is this okay? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Golnar, for a great presentation and writing such a wonderful book. And thank you, Brian, for your comments. I have just a genuine question and give you an opportunity to say maybe a little bit more about what you call the public life of prisons in the post-revolutionary period, because much of the discussion in your presentation nicely talks about this public life of prisons prior to 1979. But part of the reason I'm curious about this, as someone who's truly ignorant about this topic, unfortunately, is that from my vantage point, it seems like the past 15 years or so, there's been a lot of public discussion and debates about the death penalty and amnesty for people on death row, for instance, and so forth. So it's quite nice to see. It's been, I think, has had significant traction, the question of executions and so forth, although from what I've seen, the data, the numbers haven't been still quite appalling and shocking. But listening to you, I was just wondering, it seems like prisons are kind of separated out from execution. So I was just wondering if you could talk about the public life of prisons and maybe should we think about executions in relationship to prisons, or should they be decoupled, or what your thoughts on that?
Thank you. That's a great question. I didn't get time to go into my talk today, but one of the parts of the book that, in a way, the research surprised me the most, and as a result, I'm kind of proudest of, because it forced me to rethink some of my priors, was, when I got to the relatively recent past, so let's say post Green Movement, 2010 to now, I was shocked to see, we assume, or at least I assumed, maybe you guys are smarter than me, but I assumed that the conversations that Iranians in diaspora, or sort of folks around the world, rights activists and so forth, have about Iranian prisons, that within Iran, in Iranian discourses, there's going to be that there would be less conversation about prisons and prisoners. That's absolutely not the case, right? So that's one of the things that was extraordinarily interesting to me. But the conversations look a little bit different, and one of the things that in the last 15 years was particularly interesting to me is that some of the most conservative members of the Islamic Republic government, up to and including Khamenei, and including key sort of legal and judicial figures, and of course the prisons organization itself, have avowed over and over and over again that their goal is to reduce the number of people in prisons. This has been linked to some of the reforms that you're talking about, particularly the reform made about, the efforts made beginning about 7-8 years ago to reduce the number of executions in the country, to reduce the number of particularly drug-related offenses that would trigger the death penalty, to make it more onerous to trigger the death penalty, like you have to have more drugs, basically. But these were linked; they were of a part. It wasn't, so in my view, the execution is part of this larger structure, right? Because it wasn't just that they were talking about reducing the number of executions, but reducing the punishments overall and reducing the number of people in prisons. And in fact, their efforts have been in earnest, in the sense that there are many examples, and I go through this in the last couple of chapters in the book, there are many examples of, again, sometimes very conservative figures working to restructure the law in such a way that would trigger fewer punishments or reduced punishments for people. That includes, at the highest levels, fewer executions, although again, the numbers aren't as promising as one may have hoped when the law was passed. But it also, on lower level offenses, some of the reforms that have been made are things that that advocates for, very serious and progressive reform of carceral systems, including in the US, think of as would be huge wins for the similar movements here. Things like eliminating bail in the cases of many lower level offenses so that people are not in jails before having, for for low level offenses, letting people out without the necessity of bail, right? So making it harder, making it easier for people of lesser means to be on their own when not yet convicted. Or reducing the length of stay in prison for certain cases, or sending people to outpatient care, sending people to, so in fact, there have been several really important legal transformations made in the last 15 years. But then I started looking at it and thinking, okay, why isn't that actually changing? In some cases, the most incredible one I would say is when COVID actually hit, there was these, and I write about this in the book, there was a couple of big prison, like basically people broke out of small regional prisons that were relatively kind of not up to the modern standards of the ones in Tehran. So like there was a prison a breakout in Ali Godars, like a few, in fact, people who were waiting to be bailed out escaped from prison because they were worried about contracting COVID and dying. They were caught immediately and given more punishments and so forth. But right after that happened, there was in fact a prison amnesty, or at least a furlough for many thousands and even tens of thousands of prisoners. The sort of thing, again, that prison reform and prisoner advocates across the world were trying to demand of their own governments, saying that this will curtail the spread of disease. So it's like, how do you think about the fact that the Islamic Republic has done things that by many definitions would be considered progressive reforms, at the same time that we see that they're expanding surveillance and punishment in all kinds of directions, right? What I came to the conclusion of was that those are earnest efforts, but they're not because of they're not for the same reasons that I may be in favor of furloughing prisoners at a time of an outbreak or something. They're not with the logic of reducing social control in all sorts of directions, right? And even the execution laws are to that end. The idea is that for what's discussed beginning in the 90s and into the 2000s and certainly into 2010s is that prisons are extraordinarily expensive on the one hand, and that they're vectors of disease. So you see, when there's an HIV outbreak in Iran in the 90s and 2000s, it happens in prisons at first, and this becomes a huge crisis. We see then the government attempting to move into what scholars like Nazanin Shahrovni and others have called the Islamic Republic as problem-solving machine. It has to actually endeavor to solve certain problems in order to maintain its ability to sort of manipulate social or to control social spaces, right? So it does so through things like, as I've said, biometrics and ankle monitors for refugees, Afghan refugees coming in, a lot of biometric surveillance in refugee camps and so forth. So it's still actually expanding carceral logics. At the same time that actually law enforcement doesn't like those changes and wants to keep arresting huge numbers. So that's the other thing. Just as in the United States, there's actually an enormous amount of debate on these issues, particularly border police, border law enforcement really hates the idea that the executions will be reduced or the prison sentences will be reduced because they're constantly pushing for those. So it's actually kind of a dynamic, not unlike thinking about tough on crime politicians or law enforcement agencies here versus more liberal-minded reformers. But here we tend to think of those things as liberal and conservative, and in Iran, the conservatives actually, in some cases, most conservatives are nonetheless invested in solving problems that they see, like, oh, okay, disease is going to be a problem. We don't want prison outbreaks. We don't want riots. We have to figure out something that will actually calm this situation down. Does that make sense?
Hello, and thank you for all efforts, organizers, and you. I have three points in one question. I curious that your book and your research include about the prisons for teenagers, Kanun Islah و Tarbiyat. The second point is about the informal presence that usually it could be, for example, in some homes organized by Wizarate Etellaat, Intelligence Information, which is very different by the home arrest, you know. And the third is about, you talked about the torture, but do you have something in your book about the mental torture in the prisons, which is no evidence to show, for example, some people to others, but is very, very serious problem. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. So, well, first of all, thank you for coming, and thank you for those excellent questions. I'll begin by addressing the last one. Yes, I mean, I do attempt to talk about different forms of torture, including what recent prison writing and scholarship on Iran, some prisoners and political figures call white torture, meaning precisely psychological or mental torture that is meant to break the spirit of the imprisoned person. So yes, absolutely. That's and in doing so, you know, I'm really leaning. There's an enormous and extremely learned body of literature on torture and the effort to break souls and spirits, the sort of effort to transform psyches. You know, there's a learned sort of body of literature on that material, from the work of Dr. Ebrahimian to several other folks who work on this, and I try to add my 2 cents on that. It's extraordinarily important. And one of the things that I try to do in the book is to engage seriously with the incarcerated or formerly incarcerated dissidents, contemporary and otherwise, who talk about their experiences, who talk about their experiences in prison as a form of political theory in itself. In other words, this is how Iranian dissidents are thinking about Iranian politics in the context of prisons and experiencing, in some cases, very profound duress that they are then using to think about forms of citizenship, belonging, freedom, rights, etc., and to take those discourses seriously. So the answer is yes, but hope you can take a look and see if I do it justice. As far as the issue of informal prison is actually really interesting, because there's a history of that in the Qajar, in the Pahlavi, and in the Islamic Republic periods. You know, I could probably I don't go into great detail about it, but I do reference it to some extent. And the same with youth prisons. It's not a major focus of the book, but I do go into some detail about that. You know, I joke about this all the time, but the sad reality is, if I wanted to write a complete history of all aspects of Iranian prisons, it would probably be like 300 volumes long. So those are really big questions, though, and I appreciate your reference to them. Thank you.
Before I pass down the mic with the audience, we do have some questions from Zoom, so I will read one of them and then give it back to the audience again. Thanks for this great talk, and I hope we can see you talk at the Iran Circle in Boston sometime. Would you mind please comparing the numbers and the quality of political imprisonment before 1979 revolution and today? Is it true what Khamenei is doing today is significantly worse than what Shah did before the revolution? Also, what can you say about the recent trend of freeing some political prisoners in Iran, like Mrs. Narges Mohammadi and Ms. Bahar Hedayat?
Wait, could you, I'm having a little bit of a hard time hearing you. Could you read that last part again?
Yes. What they're asking is also, what can you say about the recent trend of freeing some political prisoners in Iran, like Mrs. Narges Mohammadi and Ms. Bahar Hedayat? Could there be any optimism about major changes in the system towards a more inclusive system? Or is this only a cosmetic move to fool the international media?
Okay, great. Thank you. That's one of the questions that I really sort of wrestled with, and I'm asked often, and I wrestle with it all the time. How do we compare the pre and the post revolutionary periods? I'm pulled into 2 directions on the answer, because sort of conceptually, theoretically, I think that, I don't love saying that some bad thing is definitely much worse than some other bad thing, because it has the effect of letting the slightly less bad thing off the hook. I'm not that interested in that. Having said that, when I say I'm pulled into two different directions, it's because in fact we see that the system itself and its use of certain methods has expanded and intensified, with every passing year. And it's not just a pre and post revolution thing. In some ways, I want to throw that kind of out the window, right? If you look at what even in the post revolutionary period, what is happening in the early 1980s and what happens today, there's a level of sort of sophistication of certain techniques and tactics today that didn't necessarily exist in the chaos of the, although there's a great deal of violence in the early 80s and so forth, there's a kind of chaos about it too. So in fact, it's, that comparison between pre and post revolution, I think what's interesting to me is thinking about, and so again, as I say, if I answered it outright, I don't like letting off the hook any torture, right? Torture is torture, so we're opposed to all of it. But having said that, again, there is a kind of what I've read and what I've learned in my studies of prisons and torture in Iran specifically, but also those topics globally, is torturers are always learning. Prison systems are always learning. Governments are always shifting. But so are people. So there's, in the very early period, you get this really interesting thing in the 1920s and 30s. The institutions are just being built. And incarcerated dissidents talk about, the prison guards would come and see us reading, so they'd take away our books. They'd see us underneath a blanket and wanted us to be more uncomfortable, so they'd take away our blanket. The idea is that people are constantly responding to each other. And what has happened in the post-revolutionary period is the accumulation of knowledge and sort of technical expertise, professionalization of the ability to torture to an extraordinarily high degree. But certainly the raw numbers are much, much, much higher in the post-revolutionary period. And we really don't see, in terms of the executions, it's just a no contest kind of situation. So that's what I mean when I say there's a kind of push and pull in my mind between not wanting to let anyone off the hook, but also understanding that there is a kind of escalation, an escalatory intensification that we see in the post-1979 period. And then just at the very, as far as optimism, this is not a very optimistic time. That might be to say the least. Having said that, I try to maintain a kind of, the American, African-American feminist theorist and prison abolitionist Mariam Kaba says, hope is a discipline. In other words, you have to kind of will yourself, you have to tabiat yourself into a kind of political hope. So whether I wake up optimistic or pessimistic, I force myself to work as an optimist. I'm not an optimist by nature, but you work for those individual releases and you hope for a systemic change. Do I think that systemic change is imminent with the Iranian system? No. I'm not naive, but I do believe that many, many Iranians want to see a different sort of world. Just as I believe many people all over the world want to see a different sort of world. So that's where I hang my hat on really unhappy days that we're all in.
Yeah. I wanted to pick your brain about memoirs. Last time I counted on my shelf, there was about 100 memoirs, prison memoirs, just after the revolution. And I had trouble figuring out, are any of them outstanding? And this is it's an unfair question, because if you look at a global level, there are probably about 4 or 5 prison memoirs that are outstanding. And the answer is simple, because prison's a boring place. Day in, day out, you're doing the same thing. There's not much thinking. So the Iranian memoirs are predominantly written to settle scores with someone or praise someone. But if you look at on a global scale, the 4 or 5 books, that prison memoirs that are outstanding, they have an agenda. They have a question. They're trying to answer something. And the Iranian ones fail for this. The only one actually that stands out is pre-revolution is Bozorg-Alavi's book. And that was interesting. In the book, he never says what his agenda is. But in an interview he gave, he said he wrote the book in order to create the myth of the Pandro-Sen affair, which was actually very interesting. He succeeded. Yeah, he succeeded.
He succeeded. Absolutely.
And that's what my point is, to have a book about a prison, you still need to have some sort of agenda. And the authors in Iran are very good at saying, you know, prison's a horrible place and so on, but we know that. Somehow no one seems to go beyond that. Is there any of the memoirs that you've come across that you would say that has something really more to say?
I hadn't exactly thought about it in those terms, so it might take me a second. I'm trying to go, I mean, because like you, I must have read, some dozens and dozens of these memoirs, right? And after a while, it's actually amazing. They just really are very similar to each other. In part, I mean, people's experiences are similar. And as you say, prison is an extraordinarily boring place. I don't know. Yeah, for me, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the best prison memoirs in the Iranian context are Bozorg-Alavi's, but he's a novelist. It's not just the agenda, but the language and the ability to put together stories in a way that just because you've been incarcerated, even if you have an analysis, you may not be a beautiful writer, right? I learned a great deal. Yes. Yeah, that's actually a good one. Yeah, I'm not sure. You know, I have to think about Irvan's question about if they're one of these truly great global prison memoirs. You know, I don't want to say no. That would be. I would rather say yes, but I don't have one that comes to mind as such. There's certainly ones that I've learned a great deal from about the Iranian context, and that includes, for instance, writings on, everything from writings on torture and white torture by Narges Mohammadi to, sort of earlier classic texts by Shahnuz Parsipour or Monir Baradaran. But a truly great sort of like a kind of literary conceptual achievement, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that a little bit more. I think that they're really, really remarkable in aggregate, though, because they produce a kind of archive that otherwise wouldn't be there of the daily practices of prisons, and in fact of all sorts of experiences that people have that are unusual.
Thank you so much. Thank you for.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. And really, thank you for coming. Thank you so much.